Hi, Janet. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you just start by briefly explaining who WILPF are and what your involvement with them is?
Okay, that'd be fine. It's the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They're the oldest women's peace organisation globally, and they originally came together to try and stop the First World War. And at that time, women couldn't even get passports in their own name. They had to get them off their dads or their husbands. Traveling was extremely difficult, but over 1,000 of them ended up in The Hague in Europe to advocate against what was happening with the slaughter that was raging across Europe. So they were feisty women, and they were mostly suffragists, and they had two main things, and one was human rights and the right to representation, which was represented through the struggle for suffrage, and the other was absolute disarmament and the recommendation that the use of force was never acceptable as a means of resolving political or ideological difference. So those two things remain completely unchanged, and we still have two main programs at the United Nations. WILPF has sections all over the world, and the UK section is one, and within the UK section there's different branches, and in particular there's a Scottish branch that is quite active, engaging with the political situation in Scotland. But the two main programs at the United Nations are still disarmament and human rights, and that's at the key to the work. So that's part of the integrated approach that WILPF takes, and the other aspect of it is that we work with women who are directly experiencing the impact of the lack of these things, the existence of weapons and the lack of human rights at a grassroots and experiential level, and communicating that at the highest political forum that there is, which at the present time is the United Nations, but they do that at governmental level as well. So the UK section has always been committed to nuclear disarmament because the UK has nuclear weapons. It's a nuclear armed state. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. But we also link with and have a different kind of understanding because WILPF, for example, has sections in African countries where uranium mining is creating civil war, where rape is used as a weapon of war, and women are experiencing that connection to nuclear weapons in a very real and very direct kind of way. So we try never to speak for each other, but to speak for all of us together, and that we're our own experts in different areas of activity. So that's really the two programs at United Nations. The one that I'm most concerned with is Reaching Critical Will, and that's about disarmament. And they have been a key player in bringing civil society into the negotiations and into the discussions at United Nations. That's an important part of what our program does. And also working directly with diplomats and encouraging them to have a better understanding of the feminist perspective on what's going on with all that stuff. So my own involvement with WILPF arose because of a wonderful woman called Helen Kay, who is a member of WILPF from Scotland. And she came to volunteer when I was working at the Edinburgh Peace and Justice Centre. She was a WILPF member, and we came up with the idea of trying to reenact the Women's Walk for Suffrage that happened in Edinburgh. And we did that to try and engage women in the political discussions around the 2007 election in Scotland, because we knew that women would be good advocates for peace, and so that was my first real active involvement with WILPF.
Fascinating to hear about the global reach of WILPF, and yeah, all the amazing work you've done. I think you briefly touched on this, but could you just talk to me a little bit more about what the connection between nuclear weapons and women's rights is, and specifically in terms of violence against women and girls, and how WILPF addresses these connections in their work?
Well, women have always been very active in nuclear disarmament activity, and I think that's because they've always had a very real understanding that the issue is a humanitarian one, and that is really the basis on which the work that was done to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons into force was very much based on the humanitarian impact of the weapons. And that may seem like an obvious thing to talk about if you're talking about nuclear weapons, but all the nuclear armed countries and the general regime around disarmament up until that point had always talked about security measures. It had taken a very political stance on looking at nuclear weapons, and still do. They still do. They still talk about all that stuff. And so while women have been very active in the disarmament movement, and that's why they've been active in the disarmament movement, until really the ICANN development, the focus on the humanitarian impact and the reality has been missing from and that's the unique thing that WILPF has brought to it. I mean, it's something that arose very much and was very effective in the campaign at Greenham Common, where women, it was a women's only setup. They tried to organise themselves in a different way from how campaigns and society are normally organised. But when you start to unpack nuclear weapons a little bit, I mean, there's one very obvious thing is that the impact of ionizing radiation on women's bodies is twice that of the impact on men's bodies. And that increases even more when you start talking about growing bodies, girls' bodies, and even to an even greater extent when you talk about children in utero. So that obviously makes nuclear weapons an absolutely fundamental issue for women. But there's more to it than that. It's also about the nature of the discourse around weapons and around peacemaking, peace building, and the show of strength and the use of force. And these are all based on very patriarchal structures. And so these are the structures that have dictated all the discourse and all the discussion around nuclear weapons. And one of the things that was done in the work for the treaty was that there was a very thorough examination of that and unpicking of that, which arose in part through WILPF's advocacy at the United Nations, the research that was done in exploring the humanitarian impacts in the conferences before the treaty got to be negotiated at United Nations. There were 3 major conferences looking at humanitarian impact, but also UNIDIR, the United Nations Research Institute, undertook a lot of research into the structures, the disarmament structures that exist at the UN, and how these things are talked about, and how the women that are involved in diplomacy is a tiny number. It's still very disproportionate. And the further up the levels you go from interns at the bottom to senior ambassadors at the top, the greater the the exclusion of women becomes. So that is definitely one of the factors in the discussions. The other factor that reduces the number of women that are involved is when you start talking about disarmament as opposed to other areas of United Nations work. As soon as you start talking about weapons, it becomes a boys' game. And that again extends, and the more vicious and dangerous the weapon, the more it becomes something where the discourse is dominated by a patriarchal. It's not to do with the sex of the people that are talking, although very often it is, but it's actually to do with the nature of the discussion and the socialization. Ray Atchison speaks very much and very eloquently about the way in which men who wake up to the fact that what they're talking about is killing people in vast numbers, if they express that in a meeting, it's frowned upon and they're made to feel like a woman, is the expression, if they do that. That's really, I mean, it's the extreme end of structural violence that is created through patriarchy.
Thank you.